The New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, NHFPI.org, has a brand new member of their team, and I'm excited to have her join the show today, as well as their research director. So we'll be diving into that over the episode. We're going to talk about what brought this new member over there, as well as we're going to dive into the state budget, because we have to, because it finally got passed by both the Senate and House, with surprisingly little fight at the tail end of it. We're waiting to hear that, but we'll get into that over the span of this episode. This is the New England Take. I'm your host, AJ Kierstead, thenewenglandtake.com. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're checking this out on YouTube. Check out the podcast feed also. Tuesdays and Thursdays, brand new episodes over there before they hit the video version. So excited to be joined by the new Senior Policy Analyst, Nicole Heller, PhD of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, AJ. It's great to be here.
And we're also joined once again by Phil Sletton, who is the research director over there. Welcome back.
Thank you, AJ. It's great to be here.
So, Nicole, you have a very interesting background. So I'm always interested by data people. I have an IT background as part of my what I do, and the reason why I'm able to do this with just me. And I'm always fascinated by data people because they just look at things very differently in ways that I can't wrap my head around. I'm just not a data guy, but I enjoy talking to people that know what they're talking about with it. I mean, to start off with, let's get into your background. Like, what led you to go into this career path?
Sure, that's a great question, AJ, and it's a very recent career pivot for me. So for the past decade, I've actually been teaching college. So I started at Colby Sawyer College a decade ago. I was there on a visiting professorship for 3 years, and then I was over at Siena College for the past 7 years. And in that time, I've taught thousands of students about research methods and statistics. And also, I was an academic advisor, so I was teaching them and mentoring them on career paths, and they'd stay in touch with me. And I heard these really cool things my students were doing, and I started to really miss spending most of my time doing data analyses and research and presenting the work full-time versus just teaching. So I started looking for careers that were more focused on just research and presenting the research. And I also wanted to come back to New Hampshire. It's really lovely here. My husband's from here. So when I saw the advertisement for a senior policy analyst with NHFPI, I knew I had to apply.
Yeah, and I trolled your LinkedIn, as one does when you're having a new person on the show, and I happened to see Mother Scholar Collective. What is that? And you had some very interesting job titles over there. What's that about?
Yeah, I'm so glad you looked it up. I'd love to plug our work. Yeah, so this is a completely volunteer collective. We came together during the pandemic. We are all mothers who worked in academia or have left academia, like myself. We have a handful of us who have gone on to other careers, and we all had babies around the same age when the pandemic hit. So I had a 14-month-old, and if you've ever interacted with small children, having a child that age while working from home is really challenging. And so we relied on each other, and then we decided, let's do research on it. So we started collecting research as participants, but also as the scholars, so participatory action research. And at this point, I'd say we probably have about 20 publications floating out there and a membership hovering around 100. And actually, I don't even think I talked to Phil about this yet, so it's kind of fun to get to share it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, especially through COVID, where you're busy with the kid. I got a 9-year-old. I'm not gonna deny the amount of time that's involved with raising a child, especially through COVID. But it must have been really nice to dive into something that you can really focus on and write on. Especially as a professor, like, things got really weird during that span of time with teaching and such. And like, what were some things that you specifically worked on for that?
Yeah, so I provided the quantitative support. So you started the show talking about being a data person, and my colleagues on the collective, many of them are qualitative researchers, so they look at the words people say and report on interviews. And I was taking the survey data, taking the numbers and seeing what's the significant difference. We are getting significantly less sleep during the pandemic, parenting and teaching at the same time. So I contributed those data, and then I also was writing. I conceptualized ideas with my colleagues, and that was my role and continues to be my role with the collective, but it's a smaller role now that I've pivoted into a different career path.
So what about the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute stood out to you, as, except from the fact it's in amazing Concord, New Hampshire, which I love living in, but what about the Institute itself stood out to you?
The mission really hit home for me, and the areas that are of interest to NHFPI, particularly those that help lift up low and moderate income families, or the policies that benefit low and moderate income families, really spoke to me. On my research background and teaching background, I have expertise in education, particularly higher ed, child health, child care, and the opioid use and abuse crisis. That was where my dissertation work came from. And so as I'm reading the mission of the Institute and the areas of interest that they studied, it felt like a good fit for me. And when I read the job description, though I was doing a very different job when I interviewed and applied for this position, it still felt like a very good fit for me. Lots of transferable skills that still fit what they were looking for, even though I was using them in a slightly different way.
So Phil, this seems like some very key topics that the Institute's really going to have to be hitting over the next few years. Now we're going to dive into the budget, but now that the budget's decided, these are a lot of very key topics that will be important for the next decade, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have a fair bit of evidence that there are, about, the survey data suggests from the U.S. Census Bureau suggests there's about 15,000 people in the state who say they didn't work in the prior 7 days, depending on when you surveyed them. They didn't work in the prior 7 days for pay or profit because they were caring for a child at home who was not in school or in some form of daycare or childcare. That 15,000 number, oddly enough, is about the same number of people who, in the usual monthly unemployment survey, indicated they were unemployed in the state, meaning they weren't working and were actively looking for work. So the idea that there's about the same number of people who are saying, I'm not working because I'm caring for a child, as there are people who are saying, I'd love to work and I can't find a job, that suggests that you could double the number of people if all of those people were to suddenly have access to childcare and enter the workforce, which it wouldn't be that clean of a switch. But if you were to double the number of people, that would, ease the workforce shortage a fair bit, right? The workforce shortage that is currently holding back the economy. Childcare is a big piece of what we'll be looking at as we now and as we're going forward. Health generally, certainly as we talk, Nicole mentioned her research around the opioid crisis. That's, another key factor in both the health of individuals and the well-being of individuals and the health of the economy overall. So yes, Nicole brings a wealth of research background and experience to be able to help us get more information out into the public sphere so that it can inform public policy discussions and lead to better policy outcomes that can help all Granite Staters. Yeah,
and these are things that very often go into the realm of qualitative discussions of data. This means this, A plus B equals C, when we really don't have the statistics to show a big problem. I've had the deputy commissioner from employment security on a couple times to talk about the workforce shortage that the state has, and ultimately he was like, maybe people retired early. Maybe it's because they couldn't find childcare. Maybe it's because COVID was an awakening where they decided to maybe we want to only have one parent work. But we need the data in order to honestly prove, in order to determine policy and to figure out what the government should do, what businesses should do. Should some random city in the state invest a lot of money into making sure that we're having zoning for more childcare facilities and things like that? It's very complex.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you've put your finger on the problem that we face a lot, and when we're talking about New Hampshire policy and informing New Hampshire policy, AJ, which is that data are limited, right? We only have so much to work with to be able to tell us answers definitively, and particularly the surveys around why people are not working or why people aren't in the labor force. There are a couple different surveys that tell us some things. They do vary in terms of the precision with which they can tell us, and tell us something definitively anyway. And and they only really provide hints. But we do know that there are a fair number of people who likely retired early. The most recent data are a little mixed as to the number of older adults who have left the labor force and have not come back. But certainly earlier in the pandemic, there was a pretty big gap there in terms of the number of people who were 55 or older saying they did not want to work right now. That number increased a fair bit, following the start of the pandemic, likely because people were trying to keep safe and healthy, and also because some people who may have been close to retirement decided that it was time to retire, right? This was a good time to retire. So there are other data that tell us that people have a temporary illness, or which we saw a lot of over this last winter, or a disability, or who are caring for either a child or an older adult that's in their life, and that as a result they are staying out of the labor force. We have some data that provide us those hints, but unfortunately, even when we have a pretty clear hint, and such as in the case of childcare, that doesn't tell us the magnitude relative to how many people would have moved into the state if there were more housing available, for example. That is a factor that's hard to measure when you're surveying New Hampshire folks. You aren't capturing the people who would have been here otherwise. And even those hints that we get around childcare, around housing, around care for older adults, the public policy solutions for those are relatively large, and the investments required to, sort of solve them in a comprehensive manner would be really significant. So it's really a question of what is the right balance, what is the right approach, and how do we approach these issues in a way that is both true to the amount of a challenge that they face, that they cause to individuals and households and to the economy overall, as well as one that informs public policy in a way that is actionable at the state level, maybe also at the federal and local level.
So Nicole, what's first up on the docket?
So this is my 2-week anniversary with NHFPI, so Phil and I have been celebrating. And for these first 2 weeks, I've really been taking in a lot of information through various articles and survey reports, and listening to podcasts and webcasts to learn the webinars to learn the landscape fiscally of New Hampshire and New England as the region. I've also been meeting other staff members from other policy organizations. We share our floor with several other nonprofits. I've been meeting those folks, getting to know my colleagues. And then I'm also working on some upcoming blogs and an issue brief in here. So that's the first 2 weeks, what's been on my docket.
That's great. And you got hired right as the budget was passed, which was very heated for a good long while. I'd like to, I got Phil here especially, I want to be sure to dive into it. Nicole, please feel free to jump in at any point during this. But, I mean, were you generally surprised at how quickly it managed to get that last House vote? Like, I was like, oh my God, it passed. I was watching Andrew Silva's feed from the Manchester Ink Link, and he was following it, and it's like, yeah, it's done. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it was noteworthy that the Senate finalized its changes on June 7th, and then on June 8th, the House agreed with them, right? Usually there is a little bit more of a gap between the Senate finishing its work and the House, taking some time to analyze and engage with it and decide whether or not they were going to ask for a committee of conference. I should note, one of the things that I had on the list for Nicole in her first weeks here were that will attend the State Budget Committee of Conference. So going into this phase of the budget process, I assumed that there would be a committee of conference, because there has been for every budget since 1999, which was the first session after the second Claremont decision. So there was a lot of discussion around what do we do in response to this requirement that we have to pay more for public education as a state. So this was not a usual occurrence, and in that way it is surprising. Past was not prologue here, but it became clear also that the House was very interested in what the Senate was doing in every step of the process towards the end. And the House and Senate budgets, in terms of their expenditure levels and their policies, were not dramatically different. While the Senate did remove quite a bit of funding from the budget, a lot of those funding changes changes were accounting changes. Basically, the Senate said these funds are authorized elsewhere or can be authorized elsewhere in the future, so we're not going to include them in the budget. And that narrowed the difference to about a 0.5% decline in the budget total if you adjust for those numbers between the House budget and the Senate budget. There were substantial changes, but the two budgets were not worlds apart, and that likely meant that the House, reflecting on the changes the Senate made, was perhaps more comfortable making that concurrence vote.
What were some big takeaways that actually made it all the way through that are going to be going live as soon as the governor inks his signature on there that are going to be really important for Granite Staters?
Yeah, so the two big systemic investments are investments in Medicaid and investments in education. Medicaid, on the Medicaid front, and this is a program that serves more than 200,000 Granite Staters and provides them with access to health coverage, particularly those with low incomes and limited resources. The state does reimburse providers for services paid through Medicaid, so a service provided to an individual who's enrolled, and those reimbursement rates do drive the extent to which those providers can pay for employees, for example. Those Medicaid reimbursement rates did receive some substantial infusion of resources in the state budget. There were also several Medicaid expansions, including the Medicaid expansion that we usually refer to when we use those words, which is the Granite Advantage program in New Hampshire targeted at adults with low incomes. And there were also expansions for 12 months postpartum, so typically young mothers or people who recently gave birth to a child, and extending that from a 60-day period to a 12-month period, how long those individuals are covered by Medicaid, as well as certain other expansions as well, particularly for lawful immigrants who are residing in the state. On the other side, on the education side, there's a big investment in the amount of funding that flows from the state to local governments through a change in the education funding formula. This doesn't get changed every cycle, and sometimes when it is changed, it receives small changes, but this was a pretty significant change. Now, in dollar terms, we're not talking, it's not doubling the amount of money, it's a much smaller increase than that, but it does direct funding through a new mechanism as opposed to a collection of mechanisms that have accrued over time to target funding at school districts that have lower property values and higher numbers of free and reduced price meal eligible students or students from low income families. So that's not, again, a dramatic change, but a significant change and not one that happens every budget cycle.
Nicole, is there anything that stood out to you as kind of a newbie looking at what's going on here in New Hampshire government that may have floated to the surface oh, what's this about?
I have to say I haven't read the budget as thoroughly as Phil, since, as you said, I did come in.
No one has. Don't worry.
Not yet. I hope the next cycle I will know it as well as Phil does. So nothing specifically stood out, but I do have to say that I'm thrilled that it went through so quickly. It seems like it was a big celebratory experience for many of the legislators. But I was a little disappointed, I didn't get to see the committee of conference. But I know there will be more committees of conference to come, so I look forward to attending one in the future.
It's so tight politically. A lot of things kept getting knocked down with the initial House version before it went over to the Senate, and that's a big reason why everyone was expecting it to be kind of crazy when it went back to the House because of that, and everything got all roped in with all sorts of culture war based legislation and such around the same time. So it was like, is it going to make it for July 1? But looks like it did. So we'll have to keep an eye on. And Phil, you've done a whole webinar series on this that's available on demand, right?
Yes, that's correct. So we did 3 webinars, one about the governor's version of the state budget, one about the House Finance Committee's version, and then one about the Senate's version, which then ended up becoming what we expect to be the final version of the state budget. And one other thing I'll mention that is a provision in there, AJ, is the elimination of the interest and dividends tax earlier.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I do want to mention that is it's a significant tax revenue source for the state. It was already going to be phased out over the next 5 years or so, and eliminating it earlier, and this is eliminating it in calendar year 2025, means that this budget was a significant increase in funding. Now that revenue source will not be available for the next state budget, so the state fiscal years 26, 27 state budget down the road. So that's a significant change in terms of the resources available to fund the state budget. Doesn't impact this biennium that much, but does impact the next biennium, and again requires some more thought about what these investments this budget made, how sustainable are those going forward if these revenue sources are declining, or in the case of the interest and dividends tax, going away.
Yeah, and I'll actually be having Greg Moore from Americans for Prosperity on the show next week to talk about that specifically I'm not going to lie, it's going to be a little partisan, but as opposed to New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, they are nonpartisan. They do fantastic work over at nhfpi.org. Please check out their posts, check out their videos, diving into these. It's definitely worth it. All reporters in the state basically look to see what they're up to, looking at the data in the state. Welcome to the team over there, Nicole.
Thank you, AG, and thanks again for having me.
And welcome back, Phil. I thank you so much for taking the time to do this, research director over there.
Thanks for having us on, AJ.
It's the New England Take, newenglandtake.com. Like and subscribe on YouTube if you're checking that out. As always, the newenglandtake@gmail.com. If you want to join the show, if you want to contribute to what I got going on over there, I'm looking for more people to be writing for me, and any partnerships that other organizations out there might be interested in. Talk to you soon.